Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to be discussing how to multiply groups of terms involving square roots. So before we begin with this problem, let's actually review a couple of things that we talked about before. So the first thing is, if you recall, multiplying square roots. So the first problem, we've got the square root of 3 times the square root of 5. So just as a refresher, remember that when we're multiplying square roots, as long as both numbers are under the square root, we can write our answer as one big square root, where the radicand part, the part underneath the square root, is just going to be the product of our original two numbers. So in this case, we would have the square root of 3 times 5, which is just 15. If we look at number 2, here we're multiplying, again, two terms. So when we multiply these two guys together, again, one of the things to remember about multiplication is that it's both commutative and it's associative. So when we see an expression like 2 square root of 3, really what that means is 2 times the square root of 3 times 7 times the square root of 5. So we just have a bunch of multiplications here. So because multiplication is commutative, I can switch my terms around. So I'm going to put the 2 times 7 first, and then the square root of 3 times the square root of 5 last. And then because multiplication is associative, I can multiply this 2 times 7 first. And then when I multiply the square root of 3 times the square root of 5, we did that in number 1. That's just the square root of 15. So in simplified form, I end up with 14 times the square root of 15. What's the shortcut for getting there? Well, when you look at my original product, notice that the 14 just comes from multiplying the 2 with the 7. So that gives me the 14. And then the square root of 3 times the square root of 5 gives me the guy under the square root over here. So I end up with the square root of 15. The next thing I wanted to remind you of is how we simplify square roots. So here I've got 5 times the square root of 18. So when I'm simplifying square roots, what I want to do is actually factor my number underneath. So 18 factors into 9 times 2, and then 9 factors into 3 times 3. Can't break any of those numbers down any further. So then 5 times the square root of 18 is really just 5 times the square root of, I've got 1, 2, and then I've got 2 factors of 3. So when we're simplifying an expression with a square root, remember that square roots just undo squares. So for every 2 factors of any type, I can pull one out. So you'll notice with the 2, I'm sort of stuck because all I have is this 1, 2. If I had a second 2, then that I could pull out a 2, but here I'm stuck. But if we look at the 3's, notice I do have 2 factors of 3. So since I have 2 factors of 3, I can pull one out. And when I pull one out, I end up with, well, the 5 is going to stay in front, and then I'm going to pull that 3 out. So I get 5 times 3. And then what's left underneath my square root is just the 2. Because again, I couldn't do anything with that. So then what I'm left with is 5 times 3 is 15 times the square root of 2. And that's as far as I can go. The last thing I just want to refresh you on is how we multiply groups of terms with other groups of terms. So here I've got x plus 4 times x minus 2. So when we multiply these together, I need to do a whole bunch of distributing. Some people call it FOIL. So the way that works is I'm going to take this x and I'm going to distribute him all the way through the second group. So x times x is x squared. Then I've got x times negative 2 is minus 2x. Then I need to distribute the 4 all the way through that second group. So 4 times x is plus 4x. And then 4 times negative 2 is going to be a minus 8 at the end. And then I just look to combine like terms. So I've got negative 2x plus 4x. Those I can combine to give me plus 2x. And that's about as far as I can go. So we're going to see how all 4 of these background situations come into play. So let's take a look back at the original. So what I want you to notice about the original is that just like number 4, we're multiplying two groups together. So I'm multiplying one group of terms being subtracted by another group of terms being subtracted. So that's going to involve a lot of distributing. So here we go. When I multiply these, I'm going to start by multiplying the square root of 3 all the way through the second group. So square root of 3 times 4 square root of 6. The way I handle that again is I just multiply the numbers outside the square root. So in this case I just have a 4. And then I multiply the numbers under the square root. So 3 times 6 is 18. Okay, then we got to distribute that root 3 to the next term. So square root of 3 times negative 1. Again, multiply outside numbers with other outside numbers, inside numbers with other inside numbers. So here I end up with minus 1 root 3. And then the second part is I need to distribute this negative 2 through. So negative 2 times 4 square root of 6. I'm going to multiply the negative 2 and the 4 together. That's 8. And then I just end up with the square root of 6 behind. And then negative 2 times negative 1 at the end is plus 2. So that's my first step. My second step then is I need to simplify any square roots. So the way that I did that, looking at the background situation, is just like number 3. So my first step was to factor this inside as much as I could. And then I look for pairs of factors, because for every pair of factor, I can pull a factor out of my square root. So here we go. If we factor 18, well, we already did this before, so we know that 18 is just 2 times 3 times 3. 3 doesn't break down any, so I just leave the second term as minus 1 square root of 3. The third term, the square root of 6, well, 6 is just 2 times 3, and then plus 2 at the end. So when I look at my radicals, the only one that really is going to simplify here is going to be this first one, because I notice it's the only one where I've got a pair of the same factor. So notice I've got the 2 3's here. That means I can pull a 3 factor out. So that first term becomes 4 times 3. The 2 is left under the square root. Can't do anything with that. The second term is going to be just exactly what it is. Can't do anything with that term. When I look at the third term, unfortunately I'm stuck there because I don't have 2 2's and I don't have 2 3's. So I can't do anything with the 2 and the 3, so I'm just going to leave it as it is. Although since I can't simplify it, I'm just going to go ahead and re-multiply what's under the radical. So I end up with a 6 and then plus a 2 at the end. The only thing I can do here is just multiply my 4 times 3 together. That's 12. And then everything else is going to stay the same. And unfortunately here there are no like terms. I guess not so unfortunate, because that means I don't need to do any more work. So this is my final answer. Okay, so here's another problem. I want you to try it on your own. Pause the video and then restart after you've given it a shot. Okay, so here we go. First step is I need to distribute this 2 root 3 all the way through the second group. So 2 root 3 times root 5 is going to give me 2 root 15. Remember, multiply outside numbers with other outside numbers, inside numbers with other inside numbers. 2 root 3 times 9 is going to be plus 18 root 3. And then I've got minus 7 times root 5 is just going to be minus 7 root 5. And then minus 7 times 9 is going to give me minus 63. Okay, if we try to simplify our square roots, well, the only number I think that factors under a radical is going to be this 15, which factors into 3 times 5. The other ones are just going to stay the same. But notice we're still stuck with that radical that we factored because I don't have a pair of any factor. I've got 1 3 and I've got 1 5. So I'm stuck there because I need a pair of factors in order to pull one out. A pair of the same factor in order to pull one out. So I'm stuck, so that means I'm just going to leave the first term as it originally was. So 3 times 5 is 15. I'm just going to leave it as 2 root 15 plus 18 root 3 minus 7 root 5 minus 63. And since I can't go any further and there are no like terms, this is my final answer.